Summer, 1940. A young man in his early 20s sits in a deck chair on the grass beside a runway in southern England. He is 21 years old. He has flown more sorties this month than he can remember. His tea is going cold beside him. A bell rings. He drops the cup, he runs. Within 90 seconds, he is climbing into a cockpit, barely wider than his shoulders, strapping into a machine with 8 machine guns in its wings and 12 cylinders of liquid-cooled fury beneath its long, elegant nose. He is 21 years old, and he is one of the few thousand men standing between a German invasion and the survival of his country. The aircraft he climbs into carries a name that will echo through the next 85 years of history, the Supermarine Spitfire. This is the story of how a single fighter, born from a dying man's last design, became the aircraft that quite possibly saved Western civilization. We will look at the man who drew its lines, the engine that gave it life, the pilots who flew it, the battles that defined it, and the strange combination of genius, timing, and luck that put it in British skies at the exact moment it was needed most. Before we begin, if you find yourself drawn into stories like this one, the forgotten moments, and the hidden details of the Second World War, please consider subscribing to the channel. It costs you nothing, and it helps us keep making documentaries like this. Thank you for being here. Now, let us begin. To understand the Spitfire, we have to begin not with the war, but with a man. His name was Reginald Joseph Mitchell. He was born in 1895 in the village of Torquay in Staffordshire, the son of a schoolmaster who later became a printer. He left school at 16 and apprenticed at a locomotive engineering firm. He studied mathematics and engineering at night school. By the age of 22, he had joined a small, struggling aircraft company in Southampton called the Supermarine Aviation Works. By 25, he was its chief designer. By his early 30s, he was already one of the most respected aircraft designers in Britain, and by his early 40s, he would be dead. In the years between the two world wars, the Schneider Trophy was the most important air race in the world. It was a competition for seaplanes. The winners earned international prestige for their countries and pushed the boundaries of speed, engineering, and aerodynamics in ways that civilian aviation had no reason to. Mitchell designed a series of racing seaplanes for Supermarine throughout the 1920s. The S-4, the S-5, the S-6, and finally the S-6B. In 1931, the S-6B won the Schneider Trophy outright for Britain, becoming the first aircraft in history to exceed 400 miles per hour. The lessons Mitchell learned in those racing years about streamlining, about engine cooling, about the relationship between wing shape and high-speed flight would become the foundation of the Spitfire. When the Royal Air Force put out a specification in 1934 for a new monoplane fighter, Mitchell submitted a design. The Air Ministry was unimpressed. He went away and started again from scratch. He was, by this point, already seriously ill. He had been diagnosed with rectal cancer in 1933 and had undergone a colostomy. He knew he did not have long. He worked in pain, often through the night, surrounded by drawings and slide rules and stress calculations. He told his wife that he wanted to finish one more design before he died. That design became the Spitfire. The aircraft that emerged was unlike anything the Royal Air Force had ever ordered. It had an all-metal stressed skin construction at a time when most British fighters were still being built with fabric-covered fuselages. It had retractable landing gear at a time when fixed undercarriages were still common. It had an enclosed cockpit canopy. It carried 8 machine guns in its wings rather than the standard 2 in the engine cowling. And it had a wing. What a wing it was! The Spitfire's wing was elliptical in plan view. The shape was not chosen for beauty, although it was beautiful. It was chosen for performance. An elliptical wing distributes lift more evenly across its span than any other shape, producing the lowest possible induced drag for a given lift. It also gave Mitchell the room he needed to fit the 8 machine guns into the wing while keeping the wing itself thin enough for high-speed flight. The thinness of that wing was critical. It allowed the Spitfire to fly faster and dive faster than almost any contemporary fighter. The combination of the elliptical shape and the thin section gave the aircraft its signature handling, light, responsive, almost telepathic in the hands of an experienced pilot. Many of those who flew it said it felt less like operating a machine and more like wearing a pair of wings. The engine was the other half of the story. Rolls-Royce had been developing a new 12-cylinder, liquid-cooled, supercharged engine called the PV-12, which would eventually be named the Merlin. It produced just over 1,000 horsepower in its early versions. By the end of the war, later marks of the same engine would produce more than 2,000. The Merlin and the Spitfire airframe were a perfect marriage. The engine gave the airframe the power to climb. The airframe gave the engine the slipperiness to convert that power into speed. Without the Merlin, the Spitfire would have been an elegant but underpowered design. Without the Spitfire, the Merlin would have been just another good engine. Together, they became something more. The prototype, given the serial number K5054, first flew on the 5th of March, 1936, at Eastleigh Aerodrome near Southampton. Captain Joseph Mutt Summers, chief test pilot for Vickers, climbed out of the cockpit after that first flight and said, simply, that he did not want anything touched. It was, in his judgment, perfect as it stood. The Air Ministry placed an initial order for 310 aircraft a few weeks later. It was, at the time, the largest single order ever placed for a British military aircraft. Mitchell did not live to see his fighter go to war. He continued working as long as he could, taking flying lessons in his spare time so that he could better understand what his pilots would experience. By 1937, he was too ill to continue. He died on the 11th of June, 1937, at his home in Southampton. He was 42 years old. The design of the Spitfire passed to his deputy, Joseph Smith, who would oversee its development through every wartime variant. Mitchell had given Britain the aircraft. Smith and his team would give it the legs to fight a 6-year war. Production proved to be a nightmare. The Spitfire's elegant lines came at a cost. The compound curves of its fuselage, the complex elliptical wing, the thin skin panels that had to be formed and riveted with extraordinary precision, all of it made the aircraft enormously difficult to manufacture. Supermarine's small factory at Woolston, on the River Itchen in Southampton, could not produce them fast enough. Between the prototype's first flight in 1936 and the outbreak of war in 1939, only a few hundred had been delivered. A vast new shadow factory was built at Castle Bromwich, near Birmingham, specifically to mass-produce Spitfires. Its early management was a disaster. Production fell behind schedule. Workers walked out. At one point in 1940, Lord Beaverbrook, the new Minister of Aircraft Production, personally intervened, replacing the management and bringing in workers from Vickers to get the factory running. By the summer of 1940, Castle Bromwich was finally producing Spitfires in the numbers the country needed. It would, by the end of the war, produce more than 12,000. The workforce that built those Spitfires was not the workforce that had built aircraft before the war. As men went to the front lines, women came into the factories in numbers that no one had imagined possible just a few years earlier. By 1942, more than a third of the workers at Castle Bromwich were women. They riveted the skins, they wired the cockpits, they worked the milling machines and the lathes. They worked double shifts and overtime and weekends. Some of them lost husbands and brothers and sons to the very war they were now arming. They went home, exhausted, to bombed houses and rationed meals, and they came back the next morning and built the next Spitfire. The aircraft that flew the Battle of Britain was theirs as much as anyone's. Then came the war. When Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September, 1939, the Royal Air Force had 9 operational squadrons of Spitfires, fewer than 200 aircraft. Through the so-called Funny War of late 1939 and early 1940, those squadrons trained, expanded, and waited. The Spitfire saw its first combat over the Firth of Forth in October 1939, when fighters from 602 and 603 squadrons intercepted German bombers attacking the naval base at Rosyth. It scored its first kills of the war, but the real test was still coming. In May of 1940, Germany invaded France and the Low Countries. Within 6 weeks, the unthinkable had happened. France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had been driven to the beaches of Dunkirk and evacuated in a desperate operation that pulled more than 300,000 men back across the Channel. Spitfires flew over Dunkirk for the first time, fighting Messerschmitt Bf 109s in earnest. They took losses, they learned, they came home. And then Britain stood alone. The continent of Europe, from the North Cape of Norway to the Pyrenees, was under German occupation or German alliance. The United States was still neutral. The Soviet Union was bound to Germany by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Italy had declared war on Britain. The only thing between Adolf Hitler and the conquest of Western Europe was a body of water 21 miles wide at its narrowest point and a small island nation that was on its knees but still standing. For Germany to invade Britain, 3 things had to happen. The Kriegsmarine had to clear the channel of the Royal Navy. The Wehrmacht had to land and hold ground. And before either of those could happen, the Luftwaffe had to destroy the Royal Air Force. As long as British fighters controlled the air over the Channel and the southern coast, no invasion fleet could cross. The German plan, Operation Sea Lion, depended on air supremacy. Air supremacy depended on defeating Fighter Command. And Fighter Command depended, more than any single factor, on its fighters. This is where the Spitfire entered history. The Battle of Britain is conventionally dated from the 10th of July, 1940, when the Luftwaffe began attacks on Channel shipping, to the 31st of October, 1940, when the daylight bombing campaign was effectively abandoned. During those 16 weeks, the Royal Air Force fought the largest sustained air battle in history up to that point. Fighter Command had, at its peak, about 19 squadrons of Spitfires and 33 of Hurricanes. The Hawker Hurricane carried most of the fighting weight of the battle, simply because there were more of them, but the Spitfire carried the symbol of it. The tactical division was largely deliberate. Hurricanes, which were robust, easier to repair, and slightly slower, were typically directed against the German bomber formations. Spitfires, which were faster and could climb higher, were sent against the escorting fighters. The pairing was almost perfect. While Hurricanes broke up the bombers and shot them down in numbers, Spitfires dealt with the Messerschmitt Bf 109s that were trying to protect them. Without that division of labor, neither aircraft alone would have been enough. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was the Spitfire's principal adversary throughout the battle and throughout much of the war. The two aircraft were, in raw performance terms, almost evenly matched. The 109 had a slight edge in climb and in dive, particularly because its fuel-injected engine could push the nose down without the fuel starvation that the Spitfire's carburetor suffered under -G. The Spitfire turned tighter and was generally more responsive in the horizontal plane. The 109 was easier to fly badly. The Spitfire was harder to fly, but it rewarded a good pilot with extraordinary capability. In the hands of an experienced pilot, the Spitfire was a tool of almost surgical precision. In the hands of a frightened 19-year-old with 20 hours on type, it was still survivable, still combat capable, still a fighter that could take its pilot home. That mattered. The Royal Air Force was losing pilots almost as fast as it was losing aircraft. Training had been compressed. Some young men arrived at operational squadrons with fewer than 15 flying hours on Spitfires before being thrown into combat. The fact that the aircraft was as forgiving as it was, despite its high performance, saved an unknown number of lives. A typical day at a Fighter Command Sector station in August 1940 began before dawn. Pilots in flying kit lay on camp beds beside their dispersal huts, trying to sleep, or sat in deck chairs on the grass, trying to read. The aircraft sat fueled and armed in dispersal pens at the edge of the field, ground crew waiting beside them. When the call came from the sector operations room, a tannoy or a klaxon would sound. Within 2 minutes, 12 Spitfires could be airborne. The pilots received their vector and altitude on the radio as they climbed. Sometimes they would find the bombers they had been sent for. Sometimes the bombers had turned back. Sometimes the only thing waiting for them at altitude was a squadron of 109s with the sun behind them. The pilots who survived that summer were often the ones who learned very quickly to look behind them at all times. But the Spitfire alone did not win the Battle of Britain. What won the battle was the Dowding system. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, had spent the late 1930s building something that no other air force in the world possessed. It was an integrated air defense network. Around the coast of Britain, a chain of radar stations, then called Chain Home, scanned the air over the Channel and the North Sea, detecting incoming aircraft sometimes 100 miles out. The information from those stations was telephoned to a filter room at Bentley Priory, where it was combined with reports from the Observer Corps inland. The filtered picture was then passed to Group Headquarters, which directed individual sector stations, which in turn vectored squadrons into the air, with specific instructions about where to go, how high to fly, and what they would find when they got there. This was something the Luftwaffe never understood and never matched. German pilots would arrive over Kent expecting to surprise British fighters on the ground and find Spitfires and Hurricanes already at altitude, in position, waiting. They would assume that British radar was primitive or non-existent. They would attack the radar towers a few times and then largely ignore them, believing them to be of marginal importance. They were wrong. The radar towers were the eyes of fighter command. Without them, the small number of British fighters could never have been concentrated against German formations effectively. With them, Britain could afford to be outnumbered, because the right aircraft were in the right place at the right time. The men who flew those aircraft were given a name by Winston Churchill in a speech to the House of Commons on the 20th of August, 1940. Never in the field of human conflict, he said, was so much owed by so many to so few. They were, after that, simply the few. There were just under 3,000 of them. Almost 600 would be killed during the battle itself. Many of the survivors would die later in the war over France, over Germany, over the Mediterranean, over Burma. Their average age was barely 22. They came from Britain, but also from Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, Belgium, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Rhodesia, the United States, the West Indies, Ireland. The Polish 303 Squadron, flying Hurricanes, became the highest-scoring unit of the entire battle. The Czechoslovak 310 Squadron was not far behind. The Spitfire and the Hurricane beside it were flown by an international coalition of men who had nowhere left to go. There were moments in the battle that have passed into legend. Adlertag, or Eagle Day, the 13th of August, when the Luftwaffe launched what was supposed to be a knockout blow against Fighter Command and lost more aircraft than it shot down. The week of the late August attacks on the sector stations, when Fighter Command came closer to breaking than at any other time. The shift in early September, when the Luftwaffe redirected its bombers from the airfields to London, giving Fighter Command the breathing space it desperately needed to repair its bases and replenish its squadrons. And the 15th of September, now commemorated annually as Battle of Britain Day, when the Luftwaffe launched 2 massive raids on London and was met by every squadron in 11 Group and most of 12 Group, losing 60 aircraft in a single day, and finally convincing the German High Command that air supremacy over Britain was not going to be achieved that summer. 2 days later, on the 17th of September, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The threatened invasion never came. The Battle of Britain did not, by itself, win the war. but it ensured that there would be a Britain from which the war could continue to be fought. Every subsequent Allied operation in Europe, every bomber that flew from East Anglia, every soldier who landed in Normandy, every American who arrived to fight, did so because Britain had not fallen in 1940. And Britain had not fallen because, among other reasons, the Spitfire had been there. The Spitfire's war was, however, only just beginning. In 1941, with the immediate threat lifted, the Royal Air Force began to take the war back across the Channel. New marks of Spitfire began to appear. The Mark V, with a more powerful Merlin 45 engine, became the workhorse of fighter command during 1941 and 1942. It was the Mark V that fought over Malta, the small island in the central Mediterranean that became, in 1942, the most bombed place on Earth. Spitfires were flown off aircraft carriers in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, taking off from flight decks and flying to Malta to reinforce the island's air defense. Without those Spitfires, Malta would have fallen, and with it the Allied ability to interdict Axis supply lines to North Africa. By 1942, the Luftwaffe had introduced a new fighter, the Focke-Wulf 190. It was, on its introduction, superior to the Spitfire Mark V in almost every respect. It could outrun, outclimb, and outdive the Mark V at almost every altitude. For several months, Royal Air Force losses on cross-channel operations climbed alarmingly. The response was the Spitfire Mark IX. It used an essentially identical airframe to the Mark V, fitted with a new two-stage, two-speed supercharged Merlin 61 engine. The improvement was extraordinary. Suddenly, the Spitfire was once again competitive with anything in the sky. The Mark IX would become, in many people's view, the finest of all the Merlin-engined Spitfires. More than 5,000 were built. The Spitfire continued to evolve. The Mark XIV, powered by the Rolls-Royce Griffon, a larger and more powerful engine than the Merlin, gave the aircraft a top speed of over 440 miles per hour and an unmatched rate of climb. Mark XIVs were the first Allied fighters fast enough to reliably catch and shoot down V-1 flying bombs as they crossed the English Channel in 1944. Late Marks, with bubble canopies and larger fins to handle the increased power, looked almost like different aircraft from Mitchell's original 1936 design. The basic shape remained. The performance had nearly doubled. Spitfires fought in every theater of the war. They flew from England over occupied Europe. They flew from Malta over Sicily. They flew from desert strips in North Africa. They flew from carriers in the Pacific. They flew from jungle clearings in Burma against Japanese Zeros. Photographic reconnaissance variants, stripped of guns and armor, polished, smooth, and painted pale blue, flew higher and faster than almost any other aircraft of the war, bringing back the imagery that made D-Day possible. A reconnaissance Spitfire was the first Allied aircraft to photograph the V-2 rocket test site at Peenemünde. Spitfires escorted bombers, attacked ships, strafed trains, dropped bombs, and at the very end of the war flew low over German cities in silence, the war finally over. By the time production ended in 1948, more than 20,000 Spitfires had been built across 24 major variants. They had served in the air forces of more than 30 countries. The last operational combat sortie by a British Spitfire took place in 1954 against communist insurgents in Malaya. They were finally retired from frontline British service in 1957, more than 20 years after the prototype first flew. For the civilians on the ground in the summer of 1940, the sound of fighter engines overhead became the sound of hope, or the sound of dread, depending on the day. Children learned to identify aircraft by their silhouettes and by their engine notes alone. A Merlin sounded different from a Daimler-Benz. A Spitfire sounded different from a Hurricane. People stood in their gardens and watched contrails curl across the sky, and they cheered when a German aircraft fell, and they went silent when one of their own did. What is left of all that today? About 60 Spitfires remain airworthy around the world. They fly at air shows, at memorial flights, at private events. They are owned by museums, by wealthy enthusiasts, by national air forces. To stand on a grass airfield and hear a Merlin engine fire up, idle, run up to power, and lift a Spitfire into the air is to hear a sound that almost certainly meant survival to a generation of British civilians. The note of the Merlin is unmistakable. It is the sound of the summer of 1940. It is the sound of the few. It is the sound of the aircraft that, more than any other single weapon, gave Britain the time and the will to continue fighting until the rest of the world finally joined the war. Reginald Joseph Mitchell never knew any of it. He died in 1937 before the prototype had even entered production. He never saw a Spitfire over Dunkirk. He never saw one over Kent. He never heard Winston Churchill's speech about the few. He never knew that the Air Ministry order he secured in 1936 would lead, 4 years later, to the salvation of his country. He simply finished his work as best he could in the time he had. Whether by luck or by fate or by simple engineering excellence, what he left behind was an aircraft that arrived on the front line at the exact moment Britain needed it most. There is a quiet question that historians sometimes ask about the Battle of Britain. What if the Spitfire had not existed? What if Mitchell had died a year earlier, before his design was finished? What if Castle Bromwich had failed to ramp up production through 1940? The honest answer is that the Hurricane alone, though a fine fighter, might not have been enough. The margin of victory in the Battle of Britain was narrow. Fighter Command came within weeks of operational collapse in late August 1940. Whether it would have collapsed without the Spitfire, no one can know for certain. But the men who flew in that battle, on both sides, generally agreed that the Spitfire made a difference that could not be measured, but also could not be denied. Adolf Galland, the German fighter ace and commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, was asked by Hermann Göring during the Battle of Britain what he needed to defeat the Royal Air Force. He replied, famously, that he needed a squadron of Spitfires. The remark was meant partly as a complaint about his own commanders and partly as a recognition of the British aircraft's quality. But it has become, over the decades, perhaps the highest compliment any aircraft has ever received from the men sent to fight against it. In the end, the story of the Spitfire is a story of timing. The right designer, the right engine, the right factory just barely ready in time, the right pilots scratched together from a dozen nations, the right radar network, the right commander in Hugh Dowding, the right enemy making the right mistakes at the right times. Any one of those things could have been different. Any one of those things, removed, might have changed the outcome of the summer of 1940. The Spitfire was not by itself sufficient, but it was, almost certainly, necessary. The young man in the deck chair, the 21-year-old who ran for his cockpit when the bell rang, is almost certainly gone now. The youngest of the few were born around 1920, which would make even the youngest of them well past 100 years old today. The last members of that generation are leaving us. The aircraft they flew remain. The story they left behind remains. And the sound of a Merlin engine in flight, 60 feet above your head, climbing into a clear summer sky, remains as well, for anyone who cares to listen. That is the Spitfire. And that is the story it gives us. The fighter that saved Britain in its darkest hour. Not by itself, but unmistakably, undeniably, part of the small handful of factors that, when combined, were just barely enough to hold the line until the world could be saved. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary worthwhile, please consider liking the video, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel. We have many more stories to tell from the long history of the Second World War, of the aircraft that fought it, and the men and women who built, flew, repaired, and remembered them. Until next time,